Hi, students. Welcome to Chapter 3 of your textbook. We're going to cover history and intercultural communications. So, let's start. Whenever we're thinking about we should start from the beginning, the question that will pop up when we're thinking about this chapter is, but where is the beginning? Why do we have to dwell on the past? Can we all move on? That's the questions when we're thinking about learning about history. Some people are thinking that it happened in the past. We don't need to dwell on it anymore. We can just focus on the present and then make plans for the future. But other people tend to think that if we don't learn about what happened in our past, we are going to be at a risk of repeating the mistakes that was done in the past. So, whatever view that you hold, we need to understand that how we view the past directly influences how we view ourselves and others. So, when we're thinking about history, maybe the first thing that you're thinking about is your history class when you were in, what is it? K-12 school, right? There are so many, history lessons that you need to learn. And yet, one thing that we're going to learn from this chapter is to think about history in a more complex manner. We're going to approach it with a very critical view of what we considered as history. So your book will cover so many different versions of histories, and so we understand that there is no single version of history. The past has been recorded in so many different ways. And if you take a look at this, quote by Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, he said, history is always written by the winners. When two cultures clash, the loser is obliterated, and the winner writes the history books. Books which glorify their own cause and disparage the conquered foe. As Napoleon once said, what is history but a fable agreed upon? So, for many of you, this may be something that you already know, that history is never objective, it's always subjective, and the history that we all come to understand is actually something that is already written by someone in the past who believed that this is the version of truth according to them. So, in this chapter, we're going to grapple with that question of now that we know there's no one truth and that there are so many different types of histories, how do we approach learning about history and how is it connected to intercultural communication? So, this shift from history to histories is important for us to step into this chapter because, like I said, when we're thinking about history courses that we have learned in the past, most of them are about political histories. We're learning about, for instance, World War One, World War II. We're learning about how this country, the US, was built, right? And we learn about who were the figures that were considered as important in the building of this country. Um, and then we can also learn about intellectual histories, which trace the development of ideas. So, for instance, when we're thinking about the idea of capitalism, for instance, where did this idea come from? And when we're thinking about how capitalism was created and then adopted by this country, and how it becomes, such an important ideology of what American is, what being an American is, it becomes something that's very interesting to understand. And I think when we're thinking about capitalism, for instance, we like to think about socialism. And so we can also learn about what were the contexts that brought socialism to come into being, for instance. And then we also learn about social histories, which tells us about how we understand the past, but from a focus on the everyday lives of people. If in the political histories we learn only of the heroes, of the important figures, now the social histories take a look at what happened in the past through the perspective of everyday people like you and I. And then we also learn about family histories. This was, may not be written down, this may not be published and known by everybody, but are passed along orally from one generation to the next. So for some people who have um, lived in the US for so long, maybe they would like to say that, oh, they could trace back their great grandfather coming from Scotland or coming from England or coming from Ireland, right? So there are so many, ways for us to understand where we came to be and what's our family histories. And then there's also national histories, which are the great events and figures of national histories. So the traditional US history textbook leaves out anything that might reflect badly upon our national character. They are written for white Americans because those were the people who wrote them, and those were the audience for the books that were written in the past. So, national history gives us this shared notion of who we are and solidifies our sense of nationhood. It simply represents one way of constructing cultural discourses and cultural identities. So, in understanding that this kind of national history is usually written by the dominant group of that time and written for that dominant group, you would see that there are so many figures that are being left out, not written because not considered as important. And that also solidified what kind of country, what kind of this notion of what kind of nation is built and can be passed on. The lessons can be passed on from one generation to the next. And that's why it says that it gives us a shared notion of who we are and solidifies our sense of nationhood. You will see that as people understand more and more about the national history of the US, for instance, we understand that there are so many different stories that were left out. And so people and historians get to actually go back and take a look at what is considered as national histories and then try to look at it from different perspectives, from different point of view. And then there's also cultural group histories, which helps us understand the identity of a group, right? So, for instance, we're talking about the Chinese immigrants, or we're talking about the Irish immigrants, or we're talking about the Japanese immigrants, the history of how they moved to the US, or the encampment of the Japanese population during the World War II. So there are so many different cultural group histories, and it's always so fascinating to learn about them. We are also talking about the non-mainstream histories. We're talking about religious history, the role of religions in understanding the past, and we understand that religious histories are never isolated. Rather, they crisscross other cultural trajectories. And we understand, for instance, in here in the US, uh, all of the elements of Christianity is embedded in the nation history. And so we understand that when we're thinking about the idea of nationhood, all of those Christian values is such a strong part of it. And then we're also learning about gender histories, which emphasizes the importance of gender in understanding the past, particularly the role of women, that most of the time get left out from the stories about the history. I think your textbook was touching about a gender history when it comes to talking about Albert Einstein past, for instance, how his ex-wife actually had a very important role in becoming an intellectual partner for him to develop his theory. Yeah. But a lot of us don't know who his ex-wife was. And so it's fascinating to go back to a person's history and to understand what other or who are the other key people that actually influence when we're thinking about the history of ideas, when we're talking about the gender histories. This is where you can see how those are connected to one another. We can also talk about sexual orientation history, which emphasizes the significance of sexuality in understanding the past and the present. So when we're thinking about this, we can also think about when was the same-sex marriage legalized, for instance. And for so many years after the US was established, what was the struggle that people with LGBTQIA's orientation had to fight to be considered as, that they are allowed. Well, I'm not going to say allowed, but they can get married lawfully. And that takes a lot of struggle on this group. We're also talking about racial and ethnic histories, which focus on the significance of race and ethnicity in understanding the past. Sometimes the histories of such cultural groups seems to question and even undermine the celebration nature of a national history. And then let's talk about the diasporic history, because like the documentary that you watch on the first week, a massive migration often caused by war, famine, enslavement, or persecution that results in the dispersal of a unified group is called a diaspora. And when this group of people came to a country, it will affect how the country functions, right? As you could see in the in the documentary about immigration in a small town in Georgia. And then, other than diasporic histories, we also talk about colonial histories, which emphasizes the important role of colonialism in understanding the past and its influence on the present. And then we're also talking about socioeconomic class histories, which focus on the role of class in understanding these experiences. It's so fascinating how class matters in our understanding of the world around us. And so the way, for instance, the middle class understand the history of the past versus the upper class understand that, the way the upper class understands that, and the way the working class understands the history of the past may look different from one perspective versus the other. So for the guided thinking activity, I have actually two questions. The first one is I do want you to look back on your own relationship with your own history. How does history help you understand who you are? And which kinds of history are more important in your identity? Is it the history of ideas? Is it family history? Is it gender histories, for instance? So I would like to hear more about it from you. And then I do want you to listen to the NPR podcast about the difficult math of being Native American. And I have 3 follow-up questions after you listen to that. I want you to I want you to answer, what do you find interesting about the podcast that you listened? How is it related to chapter 3? And what kind of history or histories are discussed in this podcast? So I look forward to reading your discussion posts, and I wish you the best of luck for this week. Thank you.